It's my pleasant duty today to welcome you all on behalf of Project Bonhoeffer. Project Bonhoeffer, you may or may not know, it's a small organization with a big idea, and that is to reawaken the understanding of Bonhoeffer's ideas and his life, because they are so important in today's generation as they were in an earlier one at the time of letters and papers and all of that. And in order to develop it, here in Leeds, a group of us got together who happened to be friends in politics and education and here in this university and in the city. And the result was setting up Project Bonhoeffer. Not only that, but we managed to find some money to do things about our ideas. And it's one thing to have ideas, it's quite another, isn't it, to face the challenge of what we do with our vision. And for all of us in our generation, there was one single word that answered it: Bonhoeffer. And for the last 10 years, we have been working with the British SCM, the Student Christian Movement. Some of you will have been members in your student days. I certainly was. And from that, that experience of being where it was at in the student years of the 1970s, particularly, the student movement was on the move, if that's the right expression. And we were able to see a lot of the ideas that Bonhoeffer was talking about being taken forward in theology and in other parts of university life. And some of it also got into the churches. And I think what we are hoping to do through events like this one today is particularly to be able to reach out to a wider audience. The SCM and PB work together to have small events, but this is the first time, and I want to, at this point, say how much we're pleased to welcome everyone who is listening to us and seeing us on the broadcast. And we hope that we'll be able to use this same way of working to do further work in the future. So from the PB's point of view, this is a step forward. We are glad to welcome you to take part in that today, and we hope you will find it an inspiration, a challenge, and an opportunity to work on the kind of vision of justice and peace, faith and order, in the sense of looking to the order that we need in a changing world, for how the church needs to act as a church, and getting, I hope, some inspiration, as I say, from Project Bonhoeffer. And today is a first step in that. And we're particularly pleased to welcome our guest speakers. I'm going to hand over at this point to Bishop Walter, who is going to introduce our guest speaker, of whom there are two, and our first guest speaker, who is here, Bishop Martin, and I'll hand over to him. Thank you.
Good afternoon, friends. I'm a retired Lutheran bishop of church here in Great Britain. When I look at this young man, I have to share with you literally two sentences. March 1997, in my old country in Poland, in Warsaw, we have a conference, European Conference for Lutheran Churches, to prepare for the assembly of LWF in Hong Kong. After dinner, this bishop comes to me and says, Jagutsky? I said, yes. Your father and my father were friends. I said, oh, that's amazing. Apparently his father from Malmö organized transport for help to the battered congregations northeast of Poland, where my dad was a senior. And so he and we became a second generation friends. Bishop Martin was born in a Lutheran family in Malmö in 1944, ordained in 1966, age 22, in Church of Sweden. He was a chair of Christian student movement in Sweden during his university days. He received his PhD in theology at the University of Lund in 1975 for thesis on Christianity and Nazism. Associated Professor of Systematic Theology at the same university in Lund in 1976. From 1978 to 1980, he was a lecturer at Tamil Nadu Theological Seminary in South India and was a vice rector with overall responsibility for teaching Lutheran theology. Rector of Church of Sweden Pastoral Institute in Lund. He was appointed Dean of Uppsala Cathedral, and from 1995 till 2011, he was the Bishop of the Diocese of Linköping of Church of Sweden. And in 2014, he was my successor for 5 years as the Bishop of Lutheran Church in Great Britain. You can see how we're linking together with Bishop Martin. Very active still in ecumenical movement, also takes part in Christian-Muslim dialogue, committed for worship, revival of Eucharist in Lutheran churches. And also he introduced pilgrimages again to the Lutheran tradition. And I took one pilgrimage in Vadstena in Sweden, which was very memorable at that time. He was also the first bishop in Church of Sweden who called for same-sex marriages in the Church of Sweden. In 2012, he was the president of the 11th International Bonhoeffer Congress in Sigtuna, Sweden. Bishop Martin is married with 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and 2 great-great-grandchildren. So I have a pleasure to introduce my friend, Bishop Martin.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you so much, my old friend. On Sunday, the 8th of April, 1945, they celebrated the first Sunday after Easter Day. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was in a small school in Schönberg in southern Germany those days, together with a rather special group of prisoners. And some of the prisoners wanted a Christian service, But when Dietrich Bonhoeffer was the only pastor in the group, and he said, no, I don't think I should lead any service here. Because he knew that some of the prisoners didn't really appreciate Christianity at all, or didn't know what it was about. But when they all unanimously said, we want you to lead a Christian service, he did that. And he preached that day in the Schoenberg school over the 1 Peter 1:3, blessed be God by his mercy. He has given us a new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. That was his last sermon. So after the Christian short service, there came Nazi men into the room and said the prisoner Bonhoeffer has to be ready for transportation. And he had to take his things with him, and he was transported 3 or 4 hours journey to KZ Flossenbürg. KZ was the Nazi way of making the short, or the word, the shortening concentration camp. They say KZ Flossenbürg. And in the evening of the Sunday, 8th of April, there was a trial, you can say a mock trial. And in the early morning on the 9th of April 1945, he was given the message that he should be immediately killed. So he was hanged naked, 39 years old, in the very early morning, today exactly 80 years ago. I will say something in the beginning of my own relationship to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I have to do that, really. Because I think that every speaker has a story. And whatever I say about him, it is colored by my story. So I have to tell you a little bit of my life, of my relationship to Bonhoeffer. Not my life, that's too much. But my relationship to Bonhoeffer. Then I will go into our present situation, a little bit about that. I will give you a summary of his own life, of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life, and end up with some theological statements from his books. And I will speak about 1 hour, not more. So when I was a young student, I think I knew more than I ever will do in my life. I was 18, 19 years old, you know, typical teenager. My father was a priest. I was raised up in a very Christian, pious home, but very open home, really. And I read books. I was hungry for books of theology or novels, whatever it was. I read everything that was possible to read. I think I understood about very little part of it, but I read it anyway. I was filled of energy, and I read it again and again and again. And thick books of theology, I read dissertations and whatever it was. And I was very proud of my reading and my knowledge, of course, and I knew more or less everything. Then about 1961 or 62, there came a Swedish translation of the letters and papers from prison. And I heard something about it, and there was a review in our daily paper. So I bought a book and started to read. And that was the first theological book in my life that I did not understand. I read it from the beginning to the end, but I could not understand it. What is this? So I put the book on the shelf and waited some months, maybe half a year. I have to read it again. So I read it once again, and I could not really, what does he mean with all these words? It's not the ordinary traditional theology. It's something completely different. What is it? And so it was on my shelf, and rather soon I started to read it more slowly, in greater humility, I would say, not from above, but from below. And when I got this new perspective, I started to little understand, bit and bit for it. Nowadays, I read it every year. In the Lenten time, in this time of the year, I read the Letters and Papers of Prison by Bonhoeffer. And I can still say I don't understand everything in the book. But it's opening new windows for me. Every time I read it, there's a new window coming with new, fresh air. My lecture here today is, of course, an interpretation of Bonhoeffer. It's all through my own eyes. I don't pretend anything else. I try to understand his life and his thoughts contextually, but it's certainly only some aspects of his life and thinking. What has been so important for me when I read it again and again, his text, is the unfinished character of many of his books, well, especially the ethics, of course, and the Letters and Papers from Prison. They were never really completed by himself, and this unfinished character has also been important for me. In a way, our lives are always unfinished, aren't they? And in a way, our thoughts are always unfinished. So there is a kinship in that. There is something close to my life in that. Well, anyway, today Bonhoeffer is read by more people in different churches than ever, and he's truly ecumenical. I have a favorite Roman Catholic monastery in northern Italy. I go every year there. I think Bishop Paulina has been with me there for a long time ago, in Bose. And it's an ecumenical monastery, of course, but they are in foundation Roman Catholic. And they read Bonhoeffer every year in that monastery. And we know in almost all Christian churches, there will be people who read Bonhoeffer and learn from him. And we can also see his statue in Westminster Abbey West Front. I think that's a sign of his ecumenical presence, that he is now a kind of saint from the 20th century. He will never be a saint, of course, but he is an example, an extraordinary example from which we can learn so much. So we live in a very difficult time, a time of uncertainty. I never thought that we should experience, again, a time when we are buying more military weapons. Even Sweden has been neutral for such a long time. Now we are a member of NATO, and we are also upgrading our military capacity extremely much. So we should, I think, in this time of anti-democratic forces, really reflect on resistance. And Bonhoeffer carried out several acts of resistance, but he was mainly a theologian who saw the need of resisting the contempt of human beings. His letters from prison, were edited by his close friend Eberhard Bethge. And in Germany, they have another title than in English. They are called Resistance and Submission. And so they are called also in Swedish, actually. Resistance and Submission. I would say in the book, The Letters and Papers from Prison, there is not much reflection about resistance as such. It's rather, as he himself writes in one of the letters, an elasticity between resistance and submission. Submission is also necessary to survive. 1 year ago, I was in a big exhibition in Sweden. It was called KZ Auschwitz. I believe it was an exhibition which went around to different places in Europe, maybe even in Britain. It was extremely big, enormously great. And I went to that exhibition, many rooms. And in all the rooms, you understand, there were pictures of those people who were suffering tremendously. So it was difficult, really, for my feelings to go through all these rooms. And all of a sudden, I saw on distance a headline. Resistance was written by huge letters. So I went to that room, the resistance room, and there was a text below the headline. And it was written like the following words: the SS in Auschwitz had as its goal to make it impossible for the prisoners to show solidarity with each other. Everything was arbitrary, the conditions inhuman. Resistance in Auschwitz was therefore constituted by actions of care, by actions when the prisoners, against all odds, showed solidarity towards each other. This word made a strong impression on me, really. Resistance against the evil is not only political acts or grenades and tanks. Resistance is much more. Even human care can be understood as resistance against the evil. I think Bonhoeffer is a good teacher for us in this sense. Who was Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Well, he was born 4th of February 1906 in Breslau. In those days, Breslau was a part of Germany. Today is Poland, Wrocław. His father was a psychiatrist, Karl Bonhoeffer. His mother, Paula, was an educated teacher. It was in those days not so common that women of her age had an education of this kind, professional education. She never got any position in any school as a teacher, but she was teaching in her own family. She had 8 children finally, and she was teaching them at home. They jumped over classes, you know, in the bourgeois families of those days. They often did that. She was a nobility woman, von Hase, Paula von Hase was her name. Her father was a professor of theology. Her grandfather was a professor of theology. So the whole setup was a rather bourgeois setup, I would say. So when Dietrich Bonhoeffer was about 12 years old, they moved to Berlin because Karl was appointed professor of psychiatry. He was number 1, really, in the psychiatry in the whole Germany. He was professor in Berlin. And the whole family moved with him to a grand villa, professor villa, all the 8 children. And it is told in the family that every evening they had an evening meal together, dinner together. And Paula and Karl were sitting with their children, eating their dinner. But it was also a seminar, so to say. They were speaking, commenting what was going on in society. So they discussed the political situation. They discussed all cultural things, theater, opera, concerts, literature, poetry, everything they could discuss. Paula was the chairperson of the whole seminar. There was only one thing they never discussed, and that was religion. Because Father Karl didn't like that. He thought religion was something for the past. That belongs to yesterday. They went to church on Easter and Christmas, I'm told, but actually it was more pro forma. Especially Karl, meant that was something for yesterday. The National War started in 1914, what we call the First World War. It was a war for many families, a war between Germany and France. And it was told that Dietrich was playing in his home with his fellows, playing war, so to say. And one evening Germany won, the other evening France won, and so forth. It was exciting exercise for a 12-year-old boy. After some time, there came a letter to the family. Walter Bonhoeffer was called into military service. Walter was the next eldest of the children. And the family went to the railway station in Berlin to say goodbye. It was a mixture of pride. One of the Bonhoeffer family was going to fight for Germany in the National War. With pride and melancholy, of course, they were leaving now one of the children to the military war. After 2 weeks, or about 2 weeks, they got a letter that he was hurt in a deadly way. And after some weeks later, the family got a message: Walter is dead. I think myself that this death of Brother Walter may have been the most important act in the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, act which had an enormously impact on his thinking and his theology. It is, of course, a little vulnerable statement, but I think there's some truth in that, really. It is told that well, the family didn't have dinner with conversations anymore, or with seminars anymore. They were eating in silence at home. They were mourning, of course. There was a new feeling when they were eating together in the evening meal. And later on, there was in his school class, he went to a class with male students. That was common in those days. And among these students, that was by the teacher raised the question, who do you want to be when you grow up? And the boys, they were saying pilots. I want to be a pilot. I want to be I want to be an engineer. I want to be an explorer. I want to be that and that and that and that. So Dietrich, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he stand up, you know, you had to raise up and stand when you answered a question from the teacher those days. And he said, I want to be a theologian. And I want to write about death. At home, I have 18 volumes of the collected books and letters by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. 18 volumes. He died when he was 39 years old. In 18 volumes, that's rather much. I'm 81. When I die, there won't be 18 volumes after me. I promise you. 18 volumes. And if you go through all these books or letters or sermons, that's not one single letter or book with the title, The Death. Not one single, as I have found it. And still I would say that everything he wrote from the very beginning is related to death and suffering and shortcomings. Yes, he became a theologian. His father Karl wasn't very happy about that, of course. He became a theologian. His first year was in Tübingen, where his grandmother lived. And yeah, there happens a lot of things there. I can't go into all the details, but anyway, he went to Rome and with his brother Klaus. And for one semester, he was in Rome studying theology at the Roman Catholic seminar. And on Easter Day, he was in the St. Peter's Basilica. He saw the procession with the Pope and the bishops and cardinals going to the Easter Day High Mass. And I would say a normal German fellow of 19 years age in the 1920s seeing this procession with all the bishops in all the clothes, they would say, "Oh, what is this? So superficial. Where is Jesus?" Dietrich Bonhoeffer reacted on the opposite. He said, "Now, first I understand something of what the church is." He recognized among the bishops from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, from Europe, together. The church was international. He came from this petty bourgeois German church. Everything was so narrow-minded. No, for the first time in his life, he saw the church is more than Germany. The church is so wide, they're international. The whole world is in the church. I think he never thought of being a Roman Catholic or converting to Roman Catholicism, but he learned much. And that happens then all the time when he met Baptists or Methodists or Anglicans and whatever. He had open eyes and ears and a curiosity. How do they think? How do they act? And why are they doing it like this? So he studied theology very fast. In 21 years age, he got his doctorate of theology, 21 years of age. 21, my friend. It's very unusual to be a doctor of theology. It was unusual even in those days, absolutely. And Sanctorum Communio he wrote, which is a very good book, of course. And even Karl Barth, who was one of the most famous theologians of those days, was praising the book. It was an extraordinary book by a 21-year-age student, and it's still worth to read. I believe we are going back to that book later on today. It is a fantastic writing, really, in that book. Theoretically, rather much, but very interesting. But he was so young, so it was difficult for him to really teach all this. Many of the students were older than him. And how could he be a teacher for all these students? So after some years, he went, he was also ordained, and he went to Barcelona and there for practice. And there are many things to say, but he went finally to New York, to the UTS, Union Theological Seminary, to study theology in a way. He was doctor of theology, but he wanted to come away from Germany and to meet new ideas, new people, which he very much did in the New York time. Every Sunday he went to the Abyssinian Baptist Church. The Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, quite close to UTS, was a church with almost only black friends. And he was more or less the only white man there. So he volunteered as a Sunday school teacher. He went for home visits to some of the families there. He was acting as a volunteer himself, and he loved it really. He got so many friends there and learned much, of course, from them. And after that year in New York, he went back to Germany, which had really changed very much. In the early 1930s, there were more or less a majority of students of theology who had the Nazi sign on their clothes. There was among the theologians an openness for Adolf Hitler and for what would come, really. And when finally Hitler became Führer in 1933, the whole family Bonhoeffer was anti-Nazi from the beginning. He was inheriting that attitude. It wasn't his own invention, so to say, but he was very much part of that. So when Hitler came into power, he recommended all the evangelical pastors to refuse funerals. And they said, "What is this? An academic from Berlin. He wants us to refuse funerals. He doesn't know anything about life. What does he mean with that?" As long as Hitler is our Reichsführer, we should refuse funerals in protest against the contempt of humanity that this fear is representing. But people laughed at him. He was just an academic man. He didn't understand the reality, really. And there was other things happening of the similar things in the Aryan paragraph. I don't think I can have time to go into that. But finally, he said to himself that he had to leave. So in a way, he fled to England. He became a German pastor in London. Here were several German pastors in those days, several congregations for Germans, and he became one of them. And here he came 1933 and stayed about 2 years. 1935 was called back to Germany because the Bekennende Kirche, the confessing church, the church who was against Adolf Hitler, started 5 seminars for students who wanted to study theology without being forced into National Socialism. Because in the universities, in the ordinary studies at the university, every teacher and professor was obliged to start the lecture with saying Heil Hitler and to end up with saying Heil Hitler. So the confessing church wanted to have an education for the pastors without this National Socialistic flavor. And so he accepted the invitation to be a leader of a new seminary in Finkenwalde in northern Germany. So he went there and he started a seminar on education. I can come back to that later on, but it was a really a new shape of theology, a new shape of introducing teaching theology that he was responsible for in Finkenwalde. Gestapo stopped that after 2 years, 1937. He continued to teach in the rectories and the vicarages. Some students came to these vicarages to learn from him. On weekends, he was there to teach. But after some years, he was forbidden to speak publicly. So he couldn't speak up anymore. He had a friend in a monastery in Germany where he could start writing his book, The Ethics. And so he did, but he never really finished the book, The Ethics, as it is published today. It's a rather thick book, and one of his absolute best books, I would say, in my opinion. And later on, he became also a member of the Abwehr, the military intelligence service. We know the police secret service, the Gestapo, the secret police. But there was a similar thing among the militaries called Abwehr. It's not so famous as Gestapo, the military intelligence service. And the military intelligence service was also led by Amiral Canaris, who was an anti-Nazi man. And there were lots of people who were recruited into the Abwehr with a similar thinking as Admiral Canaris and also Bonhoeffer. His brother-in-law, Hans Donai, recruited Bonhoeffer into Abwehr. And on the cover of being a man of Abwehr, he could travel in Sweden, actually, or Norway, and to France and to Switzerland, and meet ecumenical friends, and also give messages from the resistance movements, because officially he was Abwehrman all the time when he went on these travels. Some remarkable thoughts. When I grew up, actually, I was learned that thoughts who were similar in Christian faith with thoughts in other religions were not so important, really. So if you can find in Hinduism or Islam thoughts which are rather similar to what you are learned in the Christian faith. You shouldn't really emphasize those things because it's a coincidence. It's not so important. What is important is that is what was absolutely unique for the Christian faith. That should be emphasized. That should be lifted up. Bonhoeffer will do more or less the opposite. He will see the connection between creation and salvation because it's one God who creates the whole world, all human beings and all plants and all animals and the whole world, who is sending his son Jesus Christ to save people from the evil. So this connection between creation and salvation is coming up in his thinking rather much, and it has been for me very important, and it has been more and more important in my life, especially in the time where we live now, where the segregation is so clear. Xenophobia, Islamophobia, homophobia, anti-Semitism, all these kind of racist or segregational ideas who are so popular today, also in official thinking. Then the combination of creation and salvation becomes more and more important for me. We belong together. And as Christians, we should be the apostles of the belonging together. Contempt of humanity is one of the greatest temptations for human beings. You can say that in National Socialism there really was a theory of contempt all the time. One part of National Socialism is absolutely contempt of humanity. But if you join that group of people who are contempting, you are self part of the same thing that you are criticizing. And contempt could be either to make people smaller or bigger, either to reduce or to enlarge. It could be yourself. You can look upon yourself and say that I'm nothing at all, actually. I'm just nothing. In the adolescence time, many people do that. He writes about that in the ethics. In that time, people think of themselves as very small. Or in the same next minute, they will say, I am everything. I am the biggest in the world. So going from the very small to the very big is a kind of immature adolescence, which will follow many of us long time in our adult life. But God did not send his son, Jesus Christ, to save the woman or man in himself or herself, or the man who was enlarged or reduced. God sent his son, Jesus Christ, to save the real human being, the woman and the man who is really living his real life. And that we have to face, try to take away all this contempt. I knew from experience, he writes in one of his letters from prison, I knew from experience that there is nothing more painful than longing. It's written just before his first Christmas in prison, 1943, in December. I don't know if he's correct. I don't know if you can say it like that. I don't know really. But he writes that you can easily understand his situation, of course. He was longing for his fiancée, longing for his parents, his brothers and sisters, his friends. And to spend Christmas in prison is, of course, awful. That's human to think immediately. But how can you live with your longing if that is so painful? Well, some of us will then find a substitute. when you long for somebody who has left you, who has died maybe, you find a substitute. And my wife died 9 years ago, so I know from personal experience how extremely difficult it was. And some very good Christian friends came to me and say, Martin, you shouldn't be mourning so much. God is with you. As if God could be a substitute for a human being. As God could be minimized into a surrogate for a human being. It's blasphemic to say. And this is, I get from Bonhoeffer this insight also. How there is no other way to treat your longing than to go through it. There's no other way than going through it. Every person is irreplaceable. Every human being, woman and man, is irreplaceable. There is no substitute, no surrogate. There's only men and women created by God. Everybody unique. Being alone is necessary. If you can't be alone, you should avoid fellowship. That's rather hard. But the problem is that if you can't be alone, you will certainly seek fellowship even then, but maybe you will not like the fellowship. You will blame them for not accepting you, for not being as you want them to be, and so forth. You have to start with being alone. Or I would say you have to start to love yourself. You have to start with accepting yourself before you put your demands on all the others. We were all born in solitude, and we live in solitude. In crucial moments of our life, we all are alone. We fall in love, we get sick, we carry our cross, we die. And everything we do alone. We do believe in Emmanuel, you know, the Hebrew word for God. God is with us. But God is with us in our solitude. God doesn't take our solitude away from us, because solitude is a part of humanity. It's part of the human existence. It was a good friend of mine who had a Christmas sermon. It was a Christmas Eve in the afternoon. I was at home and I saw it on the television. It was a good pastor. I know him very well. But in the midst of his sermon, he said, "You are not alone on Christmas Eve because Jesus is with you." And I was angry. I was on the way to take the television and throw it out. What is this? We believe in God, Emmanuel, who is with us, but he doesn't take our solitude away from us, because that is part of our humanity. And we have to be reconciled with our solitude. We have to accept it and live it through. Live it through. Silence is a gift. And silence and solitude belongs together, actually. Silence is the sign of loneliness is silence, really. Silence is not commanded, not ordered, not you must be silent, not that one. It's a gift. You open your hands and receive it. Silence is nothing more than life in front of God's face, waiting for the word of God. That's a quotation by Bonhoeffer. In silence, you wait for God, for what God will tell you. In Finkenwalde, where he had this seminar, he had the order that all the students should wake up in silence. Of course they did, but they should avoid speaking to each other the first hour. They're making their toilets in silence. They're making their meditation morning in silence. They're making either had their breakfast in silence. And he gave them specially word from the Bible every day to meditate on. And in the evening, they also had silence first before they went into bed to sleep. You can say that it's normal. You can't sleep with talking all the time. But he made it a program, really, that you have some special time in silence, morning and evening. And Karl Barth, he was very negative about that. It's a monasterial thing, you know. You introduce Catholic things in our evangelical tradition, whatever, and so forth. But he was steadfast on that. He said, that's my way of doing it. Not in contempt for other ways of doing it. Not in telling the world of the church that the other Christians was less Christians, or was not that. But he wanted it this way. And I think we can learn much from it. Silence is a gift, not muteness, not ordered, not commanded, but a gift to us. Suffering is a part of human existence. Everything else is a lie. No human being can live without suffering. You have friends in your close family who are getting sick or dying. You have friends who betray you in some sense. You have friends who do something which really, really makes you hurt. Suffering is part of life. It is really something which nobody could deny. And there is nothing simple solution, no simple solution. You have to live through it. He was despised and rejected by others. A man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, and as one from whom others hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him of no account. Isaiah 53, you know the text, of course. And Bonhoeffer is directly quoting that text when he's speaking about suffering. Folly is a more dangerous enemy to the good than malice. That is written in the summary he made of the 10 years with Hitler ruled, 33 to 43. Folly is a more dangerous enemy to the good than malice. Against the evil you may protest. You may unmask it, prevent it by force. Malice contains the seeds of its own destruction. But there is no defense against folly. We are defenseless. No argument can help. No protests, no power. And in his reflections from Finkenwalde, we can also quote, which has been very often quoted, may sometimes also misunderstood, I think. Cheap grace is a deadly enemy of our church. Grace is, of course, free. It can't be bought. And then It wouldn't be grace if you can buy it by money, but something else. And to understand what he means with cheap grace, you have to see the situation in Germany those days. The German Christians, the so-called Christians who were in favor of National Socialism, they were preaching every Sunday in the schools, in the churches. They were certainly also preaching about grace every Sunday. But there was no consequences of it. They preached grace and still they continued in favor of anti-Semitism, of oppression of other people, or looking down of other people, homosexuals or immigrants, or whatever it was. Cheap grace says yes to the sin, but not to the sinner, he writes. Costly grace is also free, otherwise it wouldn't be grace, really. But it has consequences. When you really, really want the grace, you beg for it, you ask for it, you pray for it. You will get it, absolutely. But it will have consequences for your life. You have to take it seriously. I think I will soon end up with the reflections from the 21st of July, 1944. You know, the 20th of July, 1944, there was an attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler. There were 7 or 8 different attempts, but this one was certainly the most prepared and most well-prepared and attempt to get rid of Hitler. And in the group who prepared that, we can find people from the Abwehr. Admiral Canaris was there. He was also hanged the same day as Bonhoeffer today, 80 years ago, in Flossenbürg. And the 20th of July 44 was a failure, as we know. Bonhoeffer was in jail when it happened, but he got a message. He had been, as a member of the Abwehr, involved in the preparation. I wouldn't say that he was a main figure in that. We don't know anything about that, really, but he was part of it. And that was, as we know now afterwards, that was not really known by the Nazis until very, very late. He was killed 9th of April. It's only 3 weeks before the suicide of Adolf Hitler, but 4 weeks before the end of the war. Why should he be killed so late? It might be like that Hitler himself was reflecting that those people who would love to kill me, or would try to kill me, should not survive me. It could be like that. And it may be that Hitler himself was involved in a decision the 5th of April to get rid of Canaris and Bonhoeffer. Anyway, the 20th of July, it was a failure. And we know that Bonhoeffer got the message in his cell 92 in Berlin-Tegel, in the random prison Berlin-Tegel. So the 21st of July was the first letter he wrote after knowing that the 20th of July was a failure. He had been to so many different interrogations with the Nazi people during the time he was in prison, but he had a feeling, as many will say, got reactions from him, that the Nazis had really nothing to say. They had nothing substantial to criticize him for, that he was not fond of Hitler, of course not, but I mean, he hadn't done something which was really, really, really bad. They couldn't show that really. Now He must have thought, that's my thinking, he must have thought 21st of July. Now they have something. Now they can see I was a member of the group who prepared. It was a failure. So in a way, the 20th of July was a condemnation to death, actually, in a way for him. He must have thought that. So what does he write, the 21st of July? I've read that so many times. I wonder so what he wrote, the first he did, after the message. Well, he starts to say that I remember a coffee while together with my French friend in New York. And we know for sure the man he is referring to is Jean Lasserre. He was a Reformed pastor in New York in the UGS, and they were friends, and they were the same age about that. And they were fellows, really, going to different places together. And now they were sitting at the coffee with the coffee and discussing future, whatever. And in the midst of all the discussions, Bonhoeffer writes in his letter, he asked me, what is your dream of your future? What do you want to be? And I didn't know what to say. But Jean Lasserre said, I know. I want to be a saint. And Bonhoeffer writes in his letter 21st, I think he will be a saint. But now, 21st of July 1944, he reflects on what he would have liked to say, what he would have liked to answer, what do you want with your life? And I will quote that. One must abandon every attempt to make something of oneself, whether it be a saint, a converted sinner, a churchman, a righteous man or unrighteous one, a sick man or a healthy one. This is what I mean by worldliness, taking life in one's stride with all its duties and problems, its successes and failures, its experiences and helplessness. It is in such a life that we throw ourselves utterly into the arms of God and participate in his sufferings in the world and watch with Christ in Gethsemane. So you can see suffering is following all the time. To throw yourself in the arms of God and be with God in God's suffering. That is the future. Not to be something else, not to be that and that and that, but just to fall into the arms of God. Jesus never came to give us a new religion. Jesus came to give us life. Thank you.
We're going to move straight on to our next contribution, which is from a great friend of Project Bonhoeffer, Keith Clements. Dr. Clements spoke at our last event last year and was someone who we immediately felt we shared a great deal with. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome him back here today. And I'm going to move straight on to ask him to speak.
Well, first of all, let me say a great pleasure to be with you today. Well, the attendance here and the online is a sure testimony that the Bonhoeffer industry, as people have cynically called it for the last 50 years or so, is still alive and well and reinventing itself. Thank you so much. And thank you, Bishop Martin, for your talk, which was so comprehensive, informative, and moving as well, in equal measure. Thank you so much for that. How do I follow that? Well, I've suggested a title for my response as I was reflecting over the last few days, and I've called it Discernment and Courage as part of Bonhoeffer's legacy. There'll be a lot of talk about courage today in the commemorations of the life and death of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But I've put discernment, first of all, because I want to emphasize, as Bishop Martin has done, that Bonhoeffer was from first to last a theologian. And it was his discernment which called upon his courage and which illuminated the situation he was in. And I think we have to be ourselves serious, take seriously what he was thinking theologically all the time. There's been a lot of attempts to over-dramatize the Bonhoeffer story. Some of the recent portrayals of him on film in particular, I sometimes think they should be titled James Bonhoeffer rather than Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And his story doesn't need over-dramatizing at all. It's dramatic enough and tragic enough not to need the embroidery of Hollywood style glamorization of it at all. And I think it's important that we ourselves as well take stock of the discernment he had, the unusual discernment of what it was to be a theologian and to be a church in that time in Germany. And if we mustn't divorce what we think about him from what he was thinking as a discerning theologian. But first of all, about the life. That was, as Bishop Martin said, he was a young person. It's one of my favorite pictures of Bonhoeffer, actually, conducting the confirmation service of two of the young people at the German church at Sydenham, now known as the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Kirche. And that was taken at Palm Sunday, 1934. And it was two young people, Ingrid and Eduard Krusemann, who he was confirming that day. Bonhoeffer at that stage was still young, 28, but he looks so young, doesn't he? Almost hardly older than they themselves are. And that is what I love about it, because he always will be a young person for us. It's 80 years since his death. We tend to think of him as a great father of the church. He was a youngster. All the work he did in the ecumenical movement was as a youth secretary of the World Alliance for International Friendship through the churches. And his death at the age of 39 reminds us that he will be one of those who will always be young in the kingdom of God. And it's as a youth worker that we should honor him as well as being a great theologian. And I want to just venture to suggest that his discernment was apparent long before Hitler came to power, long before the cattle wagons were trundling towards Auschwitz, even before Hitler came to power, when he was still a young student. I'm often impressed by the year 1932, when he'd just come back from New York the year before. He was extraordinarily active in that year, 1932. He was a junior lecturer in the University of Berlin. He was a pastor, a young pastor, conducting a confirmation class of boys from a very poor working class district of Wedding in Berlin. He was working almost full time, but on an honorary basis, for the ecumenical movement as a youth pastor for the World Alliance for International Friendship through the churches in Europe. How he had time to do all this is anyone's guess, really. But 1932 was a critical year. As Bishop Martin has said, we live in a time of great and growing uncertainty at the time. In our time, 1932, the year before Hitler came to power, was a year of mounting uncertainty and anxiety. In Germany itself, the Nazi Party had achieved the status of the largest single party in the Reichstag, the German parliament. On the international scene, the World Disarmament Conference had made a faltering start. No one was really sure what was going to come out of it, and very little did come out of it. In Russia, people were wondering what Stalin's regime was going to do. The enormous famine came. No one was having a good word to say about Russia. In the Far East, Japan was launching its attacks into China. People were really quite trembling in that time. And I'd like to go back to that year for one or two things Bonhoeffer was up to. But my starting point really is one of the poems he wrote while in prison in Berlin-Tegel, called Night Voices in Tegel, when he pictures himself lying on his cot in his cell, awake, listening to the snores and scuffles and other noises coming from the cells of fellow prisoners, most of whom were not resistors. They were most of them petty criminals fallen short of military discipline, drunkards, deserters, and so on and so forth. And he pictures what he hears them saying in their sleep and offers a kind of prayer of contrition, of confession for that generation of Germans. And there's this haunting line in that poem. It says, "We saw the lie raise its head and we did not honor the truth." We saw the lie raise its head and did not honor the truth. And you wonder, when is he talking about? I think he's going back a long, long way back into his generation's history. One of the things he was doing was, at the time, he was also a chaplain at the technical high school, technical institute in Berlin. And Bonhoeffer would say he was very active, among other things, in the ecumenical movement at the time. He was a traveling secretary for the youth department of the World Alliance for Friendship with the Churches. That was bringing him into contact with some of the. Oops, go ahead. Where are we? No. Right. The leading figures in the ecumenical movement, especially Bishop George Bell of Chichester. And he was obviously reflecting on what was happening in his own country. And he gives a lecture at the Technical Institute on the right to self-assertion. The right to self-assertion. Everyone was in favor in the post-First World War era of Germany. Liberalization, self-assertion, your right to self-assertion. And certainly the National Socialist movement led by Adolf Hitler certainly believed in the right to self-assertion, not of the individual, but of the people. That's Volk. The nation conceived of as a kind of super self with its unique racial and cultural makeup. It was time for Germany, following the disasters of 1918, to be made great again. Well, now, I must appeal at this point to the saying attributed to Mark Twain, that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I mean, events in our time. Everything becomes a fight for existence, says Bonhoeffer in this lecture. And he says everything becomes a fight for existence between individuals, between races, between classes and nations too. The result is destructive conflict. He's not denying the right to self-assertion as such. Some people and groups really have to struggle to be taken seriously as human beings. He's just come back from the United States and seeing the experience at first hand of the Black communities in New York. But it's around what it means to be in community, says Bonhoeffer, that we have to think of self-assertion. Community is both a gift to us and a limit upon us. Life means being bound through history, and that means to other human beings. I grew up in a world that I do not give myself, but which determines me and to which I acknowledge my bond. Self-assertion is justified, he says, only if it enables my act of free responsibility for others in the community. That community is much wider than we think. We live in ever-widening circles of community. In each case, we owe sacrificial service to the other members, and in turn, each community owes responsibility to other communities. Every community, he says, even the great community of the people, lives not only for itself, but for the others. Lives in responsibility for the brother, for the people to whom one is bound in brotherhood. There's absolutely no isolated life for the people. It is bound through its birth and through its life onward to the community and through its life to the peoples in brotherhood. Very idealistic, we might think, but certainly it was in opposition to the nationalist ideology, legitimizing the pursuit of ever more living space, Lebensraum, regardless of others. And any Nazi sympathizing students in the audience must have been shifting uneasily when they heard Bonhoeffer's words. It's worth saying, just to amplify what Bishop Martin was saying, we shouldn't assume that all Nazis were jackbooted louts parading around Berlin. There were very sophisticated thinkers, including theologians like Paul Althaus, Emanuel Hirsch, who were justifying Nazism by very strongly held intellectual and theological arguments too. There was a clamor for a theology of creation at the time. Bonhoeffer went along with that, but rather unusually with his exposition of Genesis in his series of lectures in Berlin in 1932. And in that, he emphasizes that we see creation as Christians from the point of view of Christ. It's Christ who unlocks, as it were, the doctrine of creation for us, because there we see God's purpose for humanity, for humankind. And it is a life in relationship that God has created us for. Freedom, and he says it's in that context that we must think about freedom. Freedom not of self-will, regardless of others. Freedom is a relation between two persons. Being free means being free for the other because I am bound to the other. Only by being bound to the other am I free. No one can think of freedom as a substance or as something individualistic. Freedom is not just something I have at my command, like an attribute of my own. It's simply something that comes to happen, that happens to me through the other. Professor Rachel Muir's Formula of Leeds has written on this that Bonhoeffer is saying that the ideal of the free person is not the dictator who gives orders to others. Freedom, the free person is someone who's in a relationship of love and service to others. That's a very different understanding of what it means to be human. And that brings us to this word which Bonhoeffer students are very fond of quoting these days, Stellvertretung. It's a word that's caused a lot of arguments in the English translations of Bonhoeffer because no one's quite sure how to translate it. It means, it used to be translated deputyship, but I think the Americans got worried about that because it implied someone who rides into town with a star on his chest and trying to clean the place up. But it means standing in for the other, not just being aware of the other, not just sympathizing, not just empathizing, although it includes it. Elon Musk, of course, wouldn't like it because he has recently decided that empathy is the great weakness of Western civilization these days. We're getting too concerned for one another, he says. Well, we could debate that out. But vicarious representative action is a very clumsy translation, but it's probably the best I think we can do it because it includes taking upon oneself what is happening to the other person. And that, of course, was very important in the battles going on in Germany at that time. Vicarious representative action. It continues to, it first of all appears in that book Bishop Martin mentioned, Sanctorum Communio. because that is what Bonhoeffer says, the young Bonhoeffer, the very young Bonhoeffer, even then says, is what binds the church together. People being concerned with one another in the same way that reflects the action of Christ himself. Jesus Christ is the great Stellvertretung example. He took our sins upon himself on the tree. We live for others. We're called to live for others as he lived for others. It's interesting what the German Christians was saying, the Deutsche Christen was saying at that time in 1932, the same year, in their propaganda tracts, as it were, their own evangelical tracts for Germany. Mere pity, said the Germans, Christians, is charity, end quote, in quotation marks, which becomes a mixture of arrogance and of a bad conscience and makes a nation soft. We are not unacquainted with Christian love and the obligation to the helpless, so the German Christian said, but we demand that the nation be protected from the feckless and the inferior. In race, nation, and cultural heritage, we see the orders of existence which God has given us in trust. It is the law of God that we should be concerned to preserve them, therefore racial admixture is to be opposed. Faith in Christ does not destroy the race, it deepens and sanctifies it. And this whole idea of the orders of creation being fixed and final was something that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was to oppose vigorously in his in 1932 and thereafter in the ecumenical movement. People were saying we must have a theology of creation and of nationhood especially. And Bonhoeffer said, beware of this. What you want, how you understand the nation, you can't just read it off from the world as it is. You have to read it in the light of Christ. And it was an attempt by Bonhoeffer to de-sanctify the nation as something holy and good in itself and to be observed at all costs and preserved at all possible costs. Well, there's much more one could go on to say about this. I mustn't go beyond my time. He called for the church, therefore, to be able to speak against what was happening. And the church, he says, doesn't proclaim just principles that are always true. It proclaims particular words and challenging words of God for this moment today. And in one of his, again, his lectures in 1932, even before the real crisis broke, he said the church must be prepared to speak what is God's will for today, not the timeless principles of peace, order, stability, justice. Those are just words. What does it mean today? God is God for us always precisely today. And he says, this always worries us, doesn't it, in the churches, how we can be so sure of what the word of God is. And Bonhoeffer says, in the last analysis, we can't, according to our own understanding. We've got to be prepared to believe in the forgiveness of sins, even when we are speaking out. We might get it wrong, but we shouldn't be prepared. We should be prepared to get it wrong for the kingdom's sake. Just a word of my own experience in the ecumenical work. I must be careful not to give too many names away at this point, but during the build-up to the Iraq War in 2003, a group of us concerned in Geneva thought it might be a good idea if we could get the heads of all the Christian world communions together in a delegation and send them first to Washington and then to Baghdad to say, no war, stop, think about this. Mad idea, probably. It was all going very well to get this organized, but it came unstuck in the offices of one particular leader whom I will not mention, be specific, because I couldn't speak to that particular person who was a good friend of mine. He was away touring around the world on some business or other. And I was stuck with one of his minions in the office who said, yes, it's all very well, but what if it doesn't work? Now, some people are obviously paid to be cautious. They're paid to be Eeyores of this world, when there is a time for the Tigers of this world to get bouncing around and get things moving. And there's another thing to say about Bonhoeffer, I think. We always assume that he is this calm, assured, confident person, but at times he wasn't himself. You know, from that poem he wrote in prison, Who Am I? He says, people say I'm a great, confident person. Other times, I know I'm not. I'm a contemptible, woebegone weakling, he says. One occasion, sorry, is this not working? Oh, it's gone there. Yeah. Just go on one bit further, Will. Yeah, this was one occasion when he wasn't so confident, obviously. The great ecumenical meeting on the Danish island of Fanø in 1934, when he was asked by someone, he delivered this great speech there about the churches must declare against war and for peace. And someone asked him, what will you do if war is declared? This was in 1934. And apparently he picked up a handful of sand from the sand dunes where they were sitting and simply said, I pray for strength not to take up arms. That was a very honest answer to a difficult question. Incidentally, those young people sitting there around, I think that's a very moving picture, because in 1934, as young people, they were really wondering what was going to come on the scene. The two young women there, Inga, I'll forget her name now, come back to that later. They were Bonhoeffer's Berlin students in theology. The man in the middle, Otto Dudzus, was a pastor, young pastor-to-be, who went to Berlin to study under Bonhoeffer and then to Finkenwalde. Now, this is where I need Bishop Martin's help. The man at the extreme right always appears in the books as an unknown Swede. So can you enlighten us as to who this man was? Well, it's still a mystery of one of the unsolved problems of Bonhoeffer scholarship. Who was this unknown Swede on the beach there with them? No. Well, no. No. I think I must probably wind up about now. I think to perhaps we can deal with other questions in the question and answer session. But I just want to go on because it is the day of the great tragic end to Bonhoeffer's life. I just put up those names of the Abwehr people because people sometimes mistakenly seem to think that Bonhoeffer organized the resistance to Hitler, but no, he didn't. He joined in a part of that which was already underway. Hans von der Nanje, of course, his brother-in-law, Admiral Canaris, Colonel Hans Oster, who was Canaris's chief of staff, and Josef Müller, often neglected in the story, Roman Catholic diplomat, really, and church civil servant, who was his supervisor in the Abwehr office in Munich. Bonhoeffer in prison, not looking quite so youthful after 3 years in prison, as in the earlier pictures. The execution yard at Flossenburg there, a very grim place. You see at the far end of the wall there, a darker panel in the concrete. That is a memorial to those who were murdered there 80 years ago this morning. Canaris, Bonhoeffer, Rabenau, and others too. But it also bears a text, 2 Timothy 1, verse 7, a verse which says, God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. And I think that is really the note on which to end, that his greatest act of Stellvertretung was to be a representative of his country, to take upon his country's need and its guilt in its hour of need, to love his country at its most unlovable in the spirit of Christ. When he says in one of his latest prison poems, the death of Moses. He likens himself to Moses, the prophet who sees the promised land, but will never enter it himself. And those moving words where he says, to punish sin, to forgive you are moved, God. This people have I truly loved, but I bore its shame and sacrifices and saw its salvation. That suffices. And on that note, I will end, and we perhaps talk about some of these matters further in the informal session.